Okay, hi, welcome all. Thank you for kind of cutting short your dinner to come to this talk. It was kind of a last minute thing. As many of you know, I recently moved to Washington, D.C., but I'm also very involved with Nashville 2600 and Cracking the Codes, Anna, Dan Brown, and blah, 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 Cryptos. And I was invited to be on the board for the building of a new National Museum of Cryptology in Washington, D.C. So along with this, I'm doing a lot of research about that. And moving to D.C., I was really excited to go pay my respects in Arlington National Cemetery at the grave of William and Elizabeth Friedman. Now, how many people know who William Friedman is? Anybody? Okay. What? You've heard him mentioned, right? So hopefully I'll explain a little bit more about why the NSA, they just revere William and his wife Elizabeth. And it's not the case of William and his wife Elizabeth. It's Elizabeth and her husband William, but William is the better known of the two. So a little bit about them. They married in the early 1900s, and they met at a place called Riverbank Laboratories. Has anybody heard of Riverbank? Again, really strange place. There's a guy named there, an eccentric millionaire from textile industry, George Fabian, called himself Colonel George Fabian. He wasn't really a colonel. And he used his money to make a big think tank in Chicago and Geneva, Illinois. Like he would bring in a bunch of architects and he piled up a bunch of cigar boxes on the table. He said, make my building look like that. And they made the building look like that. And he was a real eccentric. Like in the house, none of the chairs or tables had feet on the floor. Everything hung from the ceiling. He had a gorilla wandering around inside. He had a zebra. He had a windmill transported to his grounds in Chicago. And he would just pick these various things that he wanted to prove, and he would hire smart people. So he had a think tank there. One of them was the effect of moonlight on plant growth. So he hired a geneticist named William Friedman and had William go out and plant seeds at different phases of the moon to see if it made any difference. Another thing was he was really interested in the idea that William Shakespeare had never actually written the works of William Shakespeare, that they had all been done by this other British lord, Francis Bacon, and that Francis Bacon had proved this by hiding codes inside the works of William Shakespeare. And there was a woman named Elizabeth Gallup who had written a few books on this, and so Colonel Fabian brought her in and hired some other researchers to work with her to try and prove this about Shakespeare. So the reason they thought that it was Francis Bacon is because he had written a book about cryptography, and there's this cipher which is called a Baconian cipher after him, where you can take any group of things and divide them into A's and B's, and I'll go into this a bit, and then take that group, and any group of 5 could represent any letter of the alphabet. Sorry? Binary, or biliteral, both. And for example, you could take flower pots, right? And one could be tall and one could be short, and you could have like short, that would be the letter A, and short, tall would be the letter B. So a form of a binary code, yes. And the theory was that when you looked at the printed works of William Shakespeare, they used all these weird fonts. There was no consistency in the fonts that were used, so they were trying to prove that if you got the right order of the fonts, that there was some sort of secret message. And this woman named Elizabeth Gallup was convinced that she'd figured it out and wrote books on it. Now, no one else was able to duplicate her work, but people kept trying. So there was this young woman there, a Shakespearean scholar named Elizabeth Smith, and this geneticist, William Friedman, and they fell in love at Riverbank. So William Friedman had been going out as a photographer with Elizabeth Gallup and her young assistant, Elizabeth Smith, to take pictures of the manuscripts in England. And they fell in love and they got married in April 1917. Now, Elizabeth taught this geneticist, William Friedman, about codes. He hadn't known anything about codes before that. I mean, he'd probably read Edgar Allan Poe, but she was really the person who taught him. And then he started writing papers about it. And he wrote a lot of papers, like a couple dozen papers, which became known, I think, as the Riverbank Publications. And so then he became the head of the Riverbank Codes and Ciphers Department. There's like 15 people there, but he became the head of the Codes and Ciphers Division and also the head of the Genetics Division. So this was all around April 1917. Well, you may recall that there was also World War I was going on around this time. And the United States entered the war in May 1917, and since there was no real crypto office, there'd been crypto in the Civil War, but it was kind of, we don't really need crypto, and everything had kind of been disbanded. So Colonel Fabian offered his Codes and Ciphers Department to the War Department, saying, here, use them, here's what you can use for cryptographers. So again, we have William, degree in genetics, Elizabeth, a degree in English literature. Neither one had studied codes, but they created the classes in cryptanalysis. And there was also this thing called the Black Chamber, won't go into that, but there was that a little bit after. So in the first graduating class of these early cryptographers, everyone in the class was supposed to face forward or to the side. Forward or to the side. And what they were doing is they were putting a code in the picture of the graduating class of the World War I cryptographers in Baconian cipher, which came out to the message, knowledge is power, which had come from an early work by Francis Bacon. So it was all kind of tying in there. So again, Baconian cipher. So from that, both Elizabeth and William just launched into these amazing careers in cryptography. They moved to Washington, D.C., they worked for the War Department. Elizabeth got hired by the U.S. Navy, then the Treasury, the Coast Guard. She's foiling the rum runners because Prohibition was going on around that time, and she was famous. You know, getting her picture in the newspaper because she was cracking all these codes, and when there were famous trials about was there or was there not a code, she was the one that was called in to testify on these things. So very well known, worked for pretty much everybody. It's estimated that she solved over 12,000 messages, personally. Then after that, she worked with the International Monetary Fund, and some people went to her and said, can you help us make codes? And she said, no, our office doesn't make them, we only break them. So that was the famous quote from Elizabeth Friedman. William also went on to an astonishing career. He'd written dozens of papers on cryptography while he was at Riverbank. He created the cryptographic terms. If you know anything about cryptography, you may have heard the term index of coincidence. He's the one that made that term. You may have heard the term cryptanalysis. He's the one that made that term. So he's creating the field as he's going. So he joined the Army. He went overseas to France with General John Pershing, where he was the personal cryptanalysis there. And when the Signals Intelligence Service was created, the SIS, he was the one in charge of it. He also helped create a system for American cryptography called the SIGABA machine. He co-designed that. And you may have heard the Japanese purple cipher. It was his team in the 1930s and 1940 that cracked that cipher. And that one you may have heard, what's the Japanese purple cipher? Was there forewarning of the Pearl Harbor attack? There was a message, but the decryption of the message didn't get to the right people in time. It was a matter of hours, and it would have been the warning of the Pearl Harbor attack, and that was because of Friedman's team and what they'd cracked in purple. So very small things can entirely change the war. 1949, he was the head of the cryptographic division of AFSA, the new Armed Forces Security Agency. Now there's all these different crypto agencies around, and they weren't coordinating really well. So in 1952, President Truman pulled them all together into one agency called the National Security Agency. Friedman was there as chief cryptologist. Now the order to create the National Security Agency was classified. So nobody knew that the NSA existed at that time out in the public. So what the joke was is that the NSA was referred to as no such agency. And if anybody worked for the NSA and someone asked, where did you work? They would just say, I work for the Department of Defense. So everybody was very, very careful about the security of it. Friedman continued to write. He wrote a series of textbooks called the Military Cryptanalysis. It was the main textbook for all the new people in the NSA for 20 years, 57 to 77. After Friedman's death, that was the textbook they used. So this is giving you an idea just how important Friedman was to the people at the NSA. He was involved with the first pushes for supercomputers, but he retired in 1956. Then he and his wife, Elizabeth, they wrote a book together called The Cryptologist Looks at Shakespeare, later Shakespearean Ciphers Examined, where they debunked everything that had been done at Riverbank, saying, no, there weren't any codes in the Shakespearean works. These were just kind of random fonts that were being used. And so every single person that said that Bacon had written Shakespeare, they were just debunking them, one after the other. They just closed the book on it. But also in the book, they hit a code. So in their book where they're saying there weren't any codes, they hit a code on page 257. And I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but in an italicized section at the bottom, just go, no, that one. Like you can see this R is a little darker, all right? You can see that T is a little darker. And if you go through all those and you use the Baconian cipher, it comes out to the message, I did not write the plays, F. Bacon. So this was them in 1957, and you can see here on Friedman's desk was that picture of the World War I cryptographers. He kept that throughout his career, that part that said knowledge is power. So he passed away in 1969, was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, the flag-draped coffin, the horses, the whole 9 yards. And he is today honored by the NSA as the Dean of American Cryptology. You can see this bust if you go to the current museum. Current museum is a very small museum. It's a building that used to be a motel next to the NSA. It was called Colony 7. It's where people would go to have affairs and things at lunch. And then eventually they said no, and they tore down some of the buildings of the motel and turned the existing motel into the National Cryptologic Museum. It's a tiny motel, maybe the size of from this wall to the other side of the kids' track. Not a lot of room in there, but that's where we keep our history of national cryptology. Now we're working on building a larger museum. I'll tell you more about that in a second. So Elizabeth, after William's death, she spent the rest of her life, till 1980, cataloging all of their works and started writing her own autobiography, her own memoirs. Everything is now at the George C. Marshall Research Library in Lexington, Virginia, a little south of Washington, D.C. It's called the most extensive private collection of cryptographic material in the world. So now that kind of gives you an idea of who the Friedmans are. And since I was moving to DC and I'm on the board to build the new National Museum of Cryptology, I wanted to learn more about the Friedmans and pay my respects. So I went to Arlington Cemetery. 400,000 graves at Arlington Cemetery, but you can kind of look up for the people that you want to find. And I went walking, and I found down there, third from the left, the grave of William and Elizabeth Friedman. And I was looking at it and going, okay, it says knowledge is power at the bottom. That's great. It's kind of a boring looking tombstone considering their fantastic career. So I took some pictures and I went home and I tweeted about it, and somebody else said, oh yeah, I was just there, and he had been researching in the Marshall Library for a new book he was working on about Elizabeth Friedman, and he'd found her sketch. And I looked at her sketch and I looked at how she was saying, please make sure that this font is done exactly correct. I'm like, wait a minute. And so then I went in and I took a closer look. And if you look at knowledge is power, like look at the E's, like look at this E and look at this E. You see this E has the little serifs on it, and this one doesn't. And this K has little serifs on it, but this N doesn't, this L doesn't. So if you take all of those and you put them into that binary, that biliteral, where you say serifs, no serifs, serifs, no serifs, no serifs, but it's kind of hard to say. So instead let's go B, A, B, A, B, A, B, A, and you go all the way through, and you put them in groups of 5, B, A, B, A, using the Baconian cipher is the letter W. A, B, A, B, using the Baconian cipher is F. So it's W, F, F, the initials of her husband, William F. Friedman. It's kind of a love note in cryptography. And they did everything in codes. They even created Christmas invitations in cipher, and they investigated other codes, historical ciphers, as one, if you've been here to PhreakNIC a bit, you've heard of the PhreakNIC manuscript, which is one that I've also spent quite a bit of time researching, is the PhreakNIC manuscript. So if you want to learn more about them, there's one good biography of William Friedman that was written in 1977 called The Man Who Broke Purple. There's two biographies of Elizabeth Smith. They came out within months of each other. Jason Fagoni, who helped me with that diagram, The Woman Who Smashed Codes, and G. Stuart Smith, who's actually her great nephew, and that's A Life in Code. And they didn't know about each other, they were just both writing biographies at the same time. If you want to learn more about codes in general, I highly recommend Simon Singh's The Code Book. David Kahn is considered the standard, The Code Breakers, written in 1967. If you want to keep track of the modern codes and ciphers, Schneier.com. He has a monthly newsletter called Cryptogram. And if you want to learn more about what was in this talk, follow me on Twitter at Yolanda Doonan. So a little bit more about the new museum. So I'm on the board to build it. There's Dick Schaefer, the head of the board. This is a man some of you may have heard of, Whitfield Diffie, as in the Diffie-Hellman algorithm. He's on the board as well. And so we're designing this new museum. Going to be a big museum. And as the plans were going up, and I was saying, oh, we're going to be hiding codes in the walls. And they, what? Wait, no one had heard of that. And I'm like, wait, we have to hide codes in the walls. So we are now hiding codes in the walls, and anyone that wants to learn more, I have a proof of concept right here. 3D printed, not exact, not the actual code, but you can kind of come in and take a look. So, I realize this was kind of a short talk. Any questions so far? Question in the back.
What's the expected opening for the new museum?
What's the expected opening for the new museum? We're expected to do groundbreaking next October, provided that we get enough funding. So we have this thing about if you want to donate to the new museum, there's a URL there, or come to me and I'd be happy to talk with you if you want to be a donor, if you want to be what we call the Founders Circle donors. There's people who are donating millions of dollars to help get this museum off the ground. Yes?
Museum, will it be a national museum or owned by,
The question is, will this be a national museum?
Yes.
Yes. Currently, we have the National Museum of Cryptology. This museum will have two functions. It's going to be the Maryland Cyber Center of Excellence and Innovation, so it will also have a lot of classrooms in it, and it will be the home of the new National Cryptologic Museum. So the current museum is kind of in this area where the plaza is. So we're going to break ground, we're going to build the new museum, then once it's built, then we're going to move all the stuff over to the new museum, then we're going to tear down the old museum and put in these plazas and parking lot, and then open. Any other questions? Okay, so one other takeaway from this, from the talk, is just because you may have learned something, like from a book or from a teacher, doesn't mean you have to simply accept it as, oh, that's the truth. Bunches of people had been to that cemetery. Bunches of people had gone to that tombstone. They didn't notice that there was a code on the tombstone until someone went in and just really looked. So go and take a look for yourself. This is hacking too. Figure it out for yourself, and you may find something that no one else has noticed. Thank you.